let's compare some neutral metallic shimmery shadows. These are predominantly single shadows, but there are some from palettes such as the Minka palette as well as the Smoky Glam from Bella Beaute bar. And this video is extra exciting because after this one you can watch another video just like this because it is a collab with my friend Riley, aka Seeking Shifts, and she will be comparing her shadows. She has shades that I don't have and vice versa, so you're going to see all the comparisons that your heart could possibly desire. So definitely make sure you check out her video. I will of course link it down in the description box. And if you're not following Riley already, you definitely want to make sure you do because she has some of the most amazing content out there between her Instagram and her YouTube channel as well. If you love comparison swatches, if you love multi-chrome eyeshadows, and you really love deep dives and in-depth analysis of eyeshadows, then her channel is definitely for you. So let's get right into the comparison swatches. So I did separate them by tone for the most part, and I will be talking more in depth about textures once we get into the swatch comparisons, but I did just want to show you in the palette. You can already tell in the pans which ones are just a little bit extra glistening, extra sparkly versus which ones look a little bit more smooth in the pan. Any of the Glimmering Creatures shades from Glaminatrix Cosmetics, they're all very beautiful and very smooth, kind of like a standard metallic formula and silky smooth metallic. And then you have probably the most textured shades in here are the shades from the Minka palette from Adept Cosmetics, and then also the Moonscapes shades from Devinah Cosmetics, with the exception of Moonlit because that shade is actually super sparkly, but really finely sparkly versus flaky. And I do want to mention there are no glitters in this comparison. These are all pigments. Some of them just might look extra sparkly. In the first set of swatches, we have the most true to silver tones. So starting off with Terra Moons, which is extremely smooth and very metallic. This one you will definitely not experience any sort of skin texture accentuation. Next up is the shade from the Cold Moon palette, and this one's actually pretty sheer, and it's almost like gray and not like really liquid metallic, but I wanted to include it in here. So it's definitely not the shiniest and the most opaque either. And then moving on, this is the shade Romantic from the Smoky Glam palette from Bella Beaute bar. Very smooth. I don't think it's as like liquid metal as the Terra Moon shade, and also it's a little bit slightly different tone, but it is still really beautiful. And then moving on to these three shades, they're not really a true bright silver. They have a little bit more of a tone to them. So they are essentially a little bit darker versions of these, but they do have a little bit of a tone. So I do see just a little bit of a plum tone in Lucent Ray, and then Wolf Moon is more taupe, and then we have Gunmetal, which also it has just the slightest hint of plum, just the tiniest bit. It's very taupey, and these are all together. I think you could easily tell which one's got the most sparkle, most kind of flakiness here, and then which ones are the smoothest. Next up are the Mauve metallic shades, and these are all very smooth and very opaque. The shade right here from Terra Moons, this one is a little bit shifty, so it's not really truly just like a metallic neutral, but I wanted to include it in here because it does have quite a bit of that shine, and I thought it was similar to these, but I think swatching now definitely a little bit less similar. There are no flaky shades here, and they are just really shiny, and I think the Terra Moon shade is definitely a little bit on the more sparkly side compared to the rest of these, but all of them I think are pretty much on par with each other. Color-wise, I think they're also almost spot on. This shade is slightly more rose gold, so it's a little bit more cooler tone than the rest of these pinks that are kind of right here around that one. But these three especially, extremely similar. I think if you had one of them on the lid and another one on the other lid, it would be really hard for anyone to be able to tell that you're wearing two different shades technically from two different brands. Next up, these have a little bit of a greenish lime, like a lime greenish or a cooler toned, really light green tone to them, and they do vary in just how much you can see it. I think it's relatively subtle in some of these, and it really very much depends on the kind of lighting you're in and how much you can see it. Definitely lighting will really tend to kind of lean these one way or another. Definitely some varying textures here. So the first shade is from Juicy, and this one is very, very sparkly. It's almost a little bit sheer, so I did build it up just a tiny bit to get it to be a little bit more on par with the rest of these. So this one definitely you could sheer out a bit more, but this one is pretty smooth, but it is very like particle sparkle. And then next to that one from Adept from the Minka palette, this shade feels almost gritty to the touch. When I first got the Minka palette, I felt like the shimmer shades were just a little bit on the emollient side, along with being flaky, but the shades have dried out a little bit since then. I've had it for a couple of years since the first time it ever launched, so I feel like I noticed the grittiness just a tiny bit more. So that is something to keep in mind. It's a little bit chunky. It does smooth out, but it feels just a tiny bit gritty. Not in an uncomfortable way, but I think if you have very, 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 very sensitive lids, you definitely want to approach these with caution, because I do think this formula tends to accentuate skin texture, especially if you don't go in with a light hand. Moving on to Moonlit, this is such a smooth, extra sparkly, beautiful shade. Particle size is very, very small, and I really wish to see more shades like this from Devinah, because the rest of the moonscapes are actually pretty chunky, like this one right here. So I would love to see more shades like this where it's just a ton of sparkle, but it's very, very smooth. And then these two shades are very, very smooth. They're a little bit more of a true kind of metallic shimmer shadow. And then the Devinah shade, this one, I feel like this one you can see the green quite a bit, but it is very, very flaky. Definitely recommend some sort of a glitter primer with this one. It's a little bit uneven as well, and this one you also want to make sure you don't apply too much, because you will definitely accentuate skin texture with that one. And then the last shade is very smooth, very metallic. It almost has a tiny bit of a hint of a flaky texture in the pan, but honestly, unless you're really digging into it, I feel like you'll be fine. And also if you use fingers, which usually I do prefer to use fingers, especially with flakier shades. The next shades are the neutral metallics that have a gold tone to them. Again, varying levels of gold. Some of them are just the tiniest hint of an undertone of yellow, and then some of them are just definitely leaning towards the gold side without being like hitting you over the face with being gold. Starting off with these shades, very smooth. Starting off with the Terra Moon shade, very, very smooth. Again, liquid metal with these babies from Terra Moons. Like, they're just so stunning and so easy to use because they are so smooth. And then the Lethal shade is actually just, it's tiny bit more textured, and it's just a little bit, it picks up a little bit less opaque than the Terra Moon shade. And then Canary's actually leaning maybe slightly lime green. So it's like a yellowy lime green versus like a gold. And then next to that one, the Adept shade. Now this one actually feels a little bit sticky, so this one did not quite dry out. And this one does also have a little bit of flaky texture to it, but it's not as obvious as some of the other shades in this palette, and it does smooth out a little bit. Just again, tiny bit of grittiness on this one. And then moving on to next two shades, very smooth. And this one is almost actually a little bit more beige versus gold or yellow. And then this one also actually kind of seems like it could go into the previous section, because it's almost, I think it's also going to depend on the different kind of lighting you're looking at it with, but these two do also have almost a greenish tint to them. But in the pan, they definitely looked a little bit more yellow. And then these two shades are very flaky. Definitely recommend a glitter primer, but if you love sparkle, you're gonna love these two shades. Super, super sparkly. And the base is a little bit more like, when you swatch it, you can see the base, and then the flakes kind of sit on top. So I think it's going to also depend on what kind of tones of mattes you pair these with and how much you want to bring out that tone. And the shade is actually a little bit more beigey toned, so it's not, again, quite as yellow as some of these shades. Next up are the taupes with slight pinky tone in some of them, so like a cooler tone baby pink, but for the most part I would call these very taupey. So this shade from Terra Moons is a highlighter, but I wanted to include it in this one. It is a very smooth, very beautiful, not quite as shiny as the other shades like the silver and the gold that we just saw in the previous swatch that was in the same place, but it is still very smooth and very beautiful. Definitely super easy to use on the eyes. Next up, Mink from Glaminatrix Cosmetics, a very smooth, like I said, a standard kind of shimmer formula. Definitely shiny and metallic, but not like molten metallic. And then the shade from Devinah, definitely a little bit textured, feels a little bit gritty to the touch. Definitely recommend a tacky primer. And then next onto like all of these shades right here, these are all very smooth, I would say. And then the most textured shade is the Adept shade for sure. It's also a little bit thicker feeling to the touch in the formulation, so it's a little bit harder to spread and it does feel gritty. And also I forgot to mention the Devinah shade feels a little bit gritty as well. So here I think tone wise the most similar shades are for sure these three right here. Very true taupe, just a very light, super cool tone. Pink is actually, I would say, even more, like a little bit darker than these three. And this one looks a little bit more warmer toned than the rest of some of these. Also, I would say very similar to this shade from Devinah, but much less textured. Also more on par with the Adept shade, so kind of these three together. And then these three are just like, they look almost a little bit lighter, I think, also because they are so smooth. And so they are so equally metallic that I think they reflect a bit more and you can't really see the base underneath, as with some of the flakier shades, since the flakes kind of tend to move around a little bit in the swatch and you have to really try to kind of rub it in to smooth it out. So you can see the base a little bit more, and that could also potentially look a little bit darker. And then the last shade here is very smooth from the Beaute Bar palette. Next up, these shades were really hard for me to place because they have almost like a pinkier purpley tone, so like the previous swatches, but they're definitely a little bit darker and they're a little bit different, especially the shade from Glaminatrix Cosmetics. This one is actually a little bit shifty and I do not feel like it really fits in here, but I did want to include it anyway. And these, we have for sure a little bit more texture with the exception of the Glaminatrix shade, which is very smooth, very shiny. But the other two shades, the Juicy shade, has a little bit of texture to it. It's a little bit like thicker in the pan, a little bit of pressure to pick it up. And I think you could definitely share this one out. It is so finely sparkly, but I think it has just a tiny bit of texture to it, especially compared to how this shade feels when you put your finger in it. And then the Devinah shade, pretty flaky and very sparkly, but definitely. Next up are the kind of peachy pinks. They're not as pink, like a cooler tone pink, as the first set of pink swatches that I showed. Starting off with Lethal Cosmetics, this shade, pretty smooth, but it does have just a tiny bit of texture to it. Next to that one, very smooth, and then the Terra shade, yet again, extremely opaque and very, very smooth. I really enjoy these. They're just so stunning, and like I said, a million times over, very easy to use. Moving on to the next three shades, very, very shiny. I do think that the shade right here is a little bit on the flaky side. It feels just a tiny bit gritty. And then this shade is probably the least shiniest out of all of them. But this one you can really see like a really cooler toned pink to them. Color wise, I think they're so extremely similar. There's just a tad bit of variation between like these versus these two for sure. I think I see a little bit more orange in these than these two, which I really see the pink a lot more, like a more truer pink. Next up are the bronzy shades. I think this one is the most kind of yellow, and these two I see the most orange in. And then these two I think are just kind of really true to color in terms of bronze, leaning a little bit more neutral for sure, especially next to some of these other shades that are so warm toned. And these are all very, very smooth, super stunning. I would classify these as antique bronze with varying levels of true to antique bronze, specifically the two shades from the Minka palette for sure, one being just a tad bit darker, but they are gritty, they are extra sparkly, they are a little bit flaky, so keeping that in mind. And then these two shades are super smooth, very metallic. Definitely think this one is a bit more metallic and it's just really reflecting off. So it almost kind of washes it out a little bit because it is reflecting so much, just like the other shades in that kind of line of shades that they launch at the same time. And then this one just a little bit less molten. Tone wise, I think I could have put this one in the previous set of swatches, and these were just really hard for me to place because I wasn't really sure exactly where to put them, because I think some of them just get really like the difference in tone is just very minute. And there you have it. Those are all the swatches of the extra sparkly, beautiful, neutral tone metallic eyeshadows between the different brands. I'm glad that I was able to show you the Lethal Cosmetics, especially, and the Glaminatrix Cosmetics, because they are non-US based, and it's definitely helpful to know you have those options. and how those textures and tones compare to some of these other brands that are from the US. I know Glam Shop also has neutral metallic shades that look very similar to a lot of these, and they are extremely affordable. Unfortunately, I do not have those, but definitely something to keep in mind if you're EU based. So I really hope this video was helpful, and make sure you check out Riley's channel to see which shades she compared, and make sure you leave her a comment and you subscribe. And that's everything with this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time.